He was a millionaire CEO with everything under control, until the day his ailing mother vanished from his office, and a mysterious little girl led her back by the hand. Ethan Cole had built his entire adult life on discipline and order. At 41 he was the kind of man people introduced as a success story, a millionaire, the sharp-minded CEO of Cole Dynamics, a company that seemed to grow more powerful with every quarter. His reflection in the glass walls of his office always showed the same polished figure, dark hair carefully combed, a tailored suit sitting perfectly on his shoulders, and eyes as blue and steady as the ocean on a calm day. Yet behind that flawless image there was a burden that even his relentless schedule could not erase. His mother, Margaret, once a brilliant librarian who could recite passages from novels without glancing at the page, was slipping further and further into the fog of dementia. Some days she recognized him immediately and spoke with clarity, as if the illness were only a rumor. Other days she seemed to lose herself in fragments of memory, wandering in conversations that belonged to another decade. That morning Ethan had no choice but to bring her with him to the office. Their nanny, Miss Rosa, who usually stayed with Margaret during the day, had fallen ill with a fever. Ethan told himself that nothing could go wrong. His mother would sit quietly in the corner of his expansive office, sipping the decaf coffee he had ordered and enjoying the city skyline. He even put on an old playlist of songs from the 1950s, melodies he knew sometimes sparked comfort in her. For the first hour everything looked under control. She sat in a cushioned chair near the window, watching the endless streams of yellow taxis crawl along Madison Avenue, occasionally humming softly to the music in her headphones. Ethan, reassured, dived into emails, meetings, and financial reports. But business never waits. A call came from overseas, lawyers demanded his presence in a negotiation, and he stepped out for what he thought would be only a few minutes. 10 minutes stretched into 20, and when he finally returned, his office looked unnervingly different. The chair by the window was empty. The headphones rested neatly on the armrest as if someone had placed them there with care, and her coffee cup sat untouched, the steam long gone. Margaret was nowhere in sight. Panic rushed through him like ice water. He tried to steady himself, thinking she might have gone to the restroom or wandered into the small kitchenette where assistants often made tea. He checked both places quickly, his heart pounding harder each second. Nothing. He asked the receptionist if she had seen his mother pass by. She shook her head apologetically. The elevator dinged behind him and a thought struck him like lightning: she could have left the floor, even the building. Ethan stormed toward security, his pulse racing faster than his polished shoes could carry him. Together with a guard, he scanned the camera feeds until the image froze him in place. On the grainy screen, there was Margaret, in her pale coat, moving slowly but steadily through the lobby. She looked calm, her face lit by a soft smile as though she knew exactly where she was headed. She stepped through the revolving doors and into the chaos of the New York streets without hesitation. For a moment Ethan could hardly breathe. His mother, whose sense of direction had been crumbling for months, had just disappeared into the most unforgiving city in the world. All the money in his bank account, all the influence of his corporate empire, suddenly felt like fragile paper. The one person he owed everything to had slipped beyond his reach while he was busy chasing deals. And as the elevator descended with him toward the lobby, his mind clung to a single desperate prayer: let her still be close, let her still be safe. The November air hit Ethan like a slap as soon as the revolving doors spun him out onto the sidewalk. The city stretched in every direction, a restless machine of noise and motion. Horns blared as taxis swerved to avoid jaywalkers, steam rose from grates in the pavement, and people hurried with their heads bent against the wind, each of them following a mental map that guided them through the chaos. Margaret had no such map anymore. The thought made his chest ache in a way that no failed contract or hostile takeover ever had. He moved quickly down the block, scanning every corner, every doorway, searching for the familiar silver of his mother's hair. His mind churned with memories as he ran. He remembered the first time she had forgotten the name of a neighbor, the slow way her handwriting had grown uncertain, and how she sometimes looked at him as if he were a stranger passing through her kitchen. He had convinced himself he was managing it all. He had found a capable nanny, arranged medical care, and carved out the illusion that he could balance business meetings and filial duty like numbers on a spreadsheet. But as he called her name into the current of city noise and heard no answer, all of that control crumbled like sand in his hands. The traffic light changed ahead and he stopped at the corner, chest heaving, eyes darting over the crowd that pressed across the street. For one terrifying moment he thought she was gone completely, absorbed into the endless anonymity of the city. Then, across the intersection, he saw her. Margaret was standing uncertainly at the curb, clutching her purse close to her body as if it were an anchor from another life. The sight of her fragile frame against the rush of traffic made his heart slam harder. But what held him frozen was not only her, it was the small figure standing beside her. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, with dark hair pulled back from her face and eyes so startlingly blue they seemed to catch and reflect the dull gray light of the city. She was holding Margaret's hand with a gravity far beyond her years, speaking to her with quiet assurance. Pedestrians brushed past them without a second glance, but Ethan could see the girl was guiding his mother, steadying her as she shifted nervously on the edge of the curb. Margaret was smiling faintly, a soft expression that Ethan hadn't seen in months, as if the girl's presence reminded her of something safe, something she could still hold on to. Ethan's throat tightened. Relief surged through him, but it tangled with guilt so sharp it made him dizzy. His mother had walked out of his care, and it wasn't his wealth or his power that had brought her back into reach, it was the kindness of a child. For a long heartbeat he could only stand there, the wind whipping his coat, watching the two of them framed by the impatient rhythm of the city around them. He knew he had to cross, to reach them before she wandered away again, but his legs felt heavy. He understood in that moment that something larger than panic had taken root inside him. It was the realization that his perfectly controlled world was not only fragile but flawed, and that the smallest hand could sometimes hold more strength than his entire empire. Lily had been walking home from school with her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders, the earbuds in her ears whispering a fairy tale about a princess who wandered into the forest. She loved stories because they made the crowded city feel softer, as if behind every corner there might be magic instead of gray sidewalks and honking cars. She was almost at the crosswalk when she noticed the older woman standing by a newsstand. Something about her seemed out of place, as though she belonged to a quieter world that the city had long forgotten. The woman's hair was pale silver, her coat buttoned unevenly, and though her face carried a gentle smile, her eyes kept drifting past people without truly landing on them. Lily pulled out her earbuds, suddenly more curious than cautious. The woman seemed to be searching for someone, turning her head as if expecting a familiar face to emerge from the blur of strangers. Lily hesitated, because her father always told her not to speak to people she didn't know, but the expression on the woman's face wasn't frightening, it was lost. After a moment of standing there with her heart thudding in her chest, she walked up slowly and asked in the smallest voice, "Are you looking for someone?" The woman blinked and focused on her, and for a moment her gaze cleared, as if she had found a patch of sunlight through the fog. Her lips curved and she answered in a tone that was both soft and strangely certain. "Baby. My baby loves blue. He has eyes just like yours. He's always rushing, but he always comes back." Lily's breath caught. She thought of her own father, who worked late shifts at the warehouse and sometimes came home long after she had fallen asleep. He had blue eyes too, and when he returned he always looked so tired, but he never failed to smile at her as if that was the most important part of his day. She felt a thread of recognition pulling her closer to the woman. The way she spoke reminded Lily of waiting at the window for her dad, hoping each set of footsteps on the stairs would be his. Without really thinking about it, she reached for the woman's hand. The skin was cool and fragile, but the grip that answered was surprisingly firm, as though holding on to Lily gave her direction again. The city churned around them, indifferent, but Lily stood still, making a decision with the seriousness of someone far older. If this woman was lost, then someone had to help her find her way back, and if Lily had been in her place, she would have wanted the same kindness. She began to guide the woman carefully down the block, asking passers-by in her clear child's voice if they had seen a tall man with dark hair and blue eyes. Most people shook their heads and moved on, but Lily didn't give up. The woman followed obediently, her smile growing each time Lily glanced back to reassure her. Eventually the glass tower loomed ahead of them, its steel and mirrors rising into the gray sky. Lily felt an odd certainty that this was where they needed to go, though she didn't know why. The guard at the front desk looked up in surprise when he saw them enter. His eyes widened with recognition, and he quickly stepped forward to confirm what Lily already suspected: the woman belonged here. She had been searching for someone important, and Lily had brought her to the right place. The guard was already reaching for his phone when the elevator doors slid open. A man rushed out, his expression frantic, his dark hair slightly disheveled, and his eyes, so blue they could not be mistaken, fixed instantly on the woman at Lily's side. For Lily, the moment was both ordinary and extraordinary. She had simply done what felt right, but she sensed that something much larger had just unfolded. She held the woman's hand a little tighter, steadying her as the man approached, and realized she had just become the bridge between a mother searching for her son and a son who had nearly lost everything. The moment Ethan stepped out of the elevator into the lobby, he felt as though the air itself shifted, charged with something both terrifying and miraculous. His eyes, frantic only seconds before, locked instantly on the pair standing by the sofa near the entrance. There was his mother, smaller than he remembered, her silver hair catching the light from the tall glass windows, her shoulders stooped but her presence undeniable. And beside her, holding her hand with a calmness that seemed impossible for her age, stood the little girl. She looked so fragile against the endless swirl of professionals in tailored suits and tourists dragging luggage, yet she stood as if she were the anchor holding his mother steady. Ethan's steps faltered because for one surreal instant he couldn't quite process what he was seeing, as if his desperate imagination had conjured them both out of thin air. Margaret turned her head toward him, her blue eyes searching through layers of memory until they settled on his face. She smiled faintly, though confusion rippled across her features, and she whispered, "Daddy," before her brow furrowed and she shook her head. Her voice grew more certain as she corrected herself. "No, not Daddy. Son. Ethan." The sound of his name from her lips pierced through him, unraveling the tension that had coiled in his chest since the moment he had found her missing. He hurried forward, dropping down to his knees in front of her without a single thought for the crowd that had now gathered to witness the strange reunion. Secretaries whispered at the reception desk, a pair of executives paused mid-conversation, even the security guards lingered nearby, their eyes wide. Yet to Ethan the entire lobby had shrunk until there was only his mother, fragile and bewildered, and the child who had led her back. "I'm here, Mom," he said, his voice breaking despite all the years he had trained it to remain steady in boardrooms and negotiations. "I'm here. I'm so sorry." He reached for her hands, and she clutched them with surprising strength, leaning forward to pull him into an embrace that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. For a few seconds, as she buried her face against his shoulder, it felt like he had her back completely, like time had rewound to when she was still the steady center of his world and not someone lost to a failing memory. He closed his eyes, letting himself breathe in the reality of that touch, knowing how fleeting it might be. When he finally pulled back, his gaze shifted to the girl who had made this moment possible. She was still standing beside his mother, her small fingers wrapped gently but firmly around Margaret's hand as if she had promised not to let go until someone safe arrived. Ethan found himself staring into those bright blue eyes that mirrored his own, eyes full of both innocence and an unshakable sense of responsibility. He swallowed hard, realizing that everything he had, his wealth, his empire, his authority, had failed him in the one moment that mattered, and yet this child, a stranger, had succeeded. "You brought her back to me?" His words trembled with disbelief as much as gratitude. The girl nodded without hesitation, her tone steady, almost casual, as though she had simply done what anyone would. "She was looking for a baby with blue eyes," she explained. I thought that must be you." Ethan laughed, though the sound came out tangled with tears that slipped freely down his cheeks. He couldn't remember the last time he had allowed himself to cry in public, but in that instant he didn't care. His mother leaned closer, still gripping his hands, and the girl remained by her side, unwavering in her quiet strength. Around them the lobby had fallen into a hush, strangers watching something rare unfold, a reminder that in a city built on speed and ambition, the simplest act of compassion could stop time. Ethan felt the weight of the moment press into him like a seal, burning the lesson into his soul. He had nearly lost his mother in the space of an hour, but fate had given him back more than he had lost. It had shown him the power of a child's courage, the fragility of all the things he thought he controlled, and the unshakable truth that love sometimes arrives in the smallest, most unexpected form. And kneeling there on the polished floor, his mother's trembling hand in his own and a little girl watching with eyes like a mirror, he understood with absolute clarity that nothing in his world would ever be the same. Ethan guided his mother back into his office, her steps unsteady but her grip on his arm surprisingly firm, as though she understood on some instinctive level that she had scared him nearly to death. He eased her onto the couch near the window, covered her with a soft blanket, and watched as she closed her eyes and drifted into a shallow, fragile sleep. The rise and fall of her breathing soothed him, but the tremor in his hands did not stop. He turned then to the girl, who sat patiently in the chair across from him, swinging her legs a little as if this grand office were no different than her classroom. He asked her name, and she told him it was Lily, her voice gentle and clear. He thanked her in a tone that felt inadequate, as if words could never match the enormity of what she had done. The coffee machine in the corner caught his eye, and though it was designed for espressos and lattes that fueled high-powered executives, he bent down and filled a cup with hot cocoa powder he found in a drawer. He handed it to Lily with both hands, trying to show her the respect she deserved, and she accepted it with a small smile that made her look at once like a child and like someone far older than her years. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, watching her carefully sip the drink, and finally asked if she had been afraid when she found his mother. Lily hesitated, eyes lowering to the cup, before nodding. "I was scared," she admitted honestly. "But if my grandma ever got lost, I'd hope someone would help her. I thought maybe I could be that someone for her." The simplicity of her reasoning struck him with a force greater than any lecture or headline. He pressed his hand against his face, overwhelmed by how easily a child could name the truth he had been evading for months. Ethan pulled out his phone and asked if she wanted him to call someone. She nodded eagerly and gave him her father's number. When Daniel answered, Ethan could hear the alarm in his voice as Lily quickly assured him that she was safe. Within minutes Daniel was on his way, leaving Ethan with more time to study the girl who had just shifted the axis of his world. He thought about all the times he had told himself he was doing enough by providing for his mother financially, by arranging caretakers and scheduling appointments between meetings. The picture of Lily holding his mother's hand on a busy street corner refused to leave his mind. A child with no resources beyond kindness had done what he, with all his wealth and power, could not. When Daniel finally arrived, slightly out of breath and covered in the dust of a long shift at the warehouse, he pulled his daughter into his arms with such obvious relief that Ethan felt an ache of envy. The love between them was unspoken but absolute, and Ethan wondered if his own mother had looked at him that way once, when he was small enough to need her for everything. He shook Daniel's hand and thanked him for raising a daughter with such courage. Daniel brushed it off humbly, saying that Lily had always been like that, curious and unafraid to help people. Ethan invited them both to sit a little longer, unwilling to let them leave so quickly, and as they talked he found himself asking questions he never would have thought to ask another man a few hours earlier. He wanted to know about Daniel's work, his hours, how he managed to balance parenting and providing. The more Daniel spoke, the clearer it became that he was talented, intelligent, and resourceful, yet stuck in a job that undervalued him. Something shifted inside Ethan as the conversation unfolded. He had walked into the day believing that the highlight of his week would be a merger worth billions, but now all of that seemed hollow. He could not shake the realization that he had nearly lost his mother because he had been too focused on numbers and deals, too confident that everything could be managed by structure and delegation. What mattered now was not the contracts waiting on his desk, but the human beings in front of him, the frail woman dozing on his couch, the child who had led her home, and the father who carried the weight of both love and survival on his shoulders. When Daniel and Lily finally stood to leave, Ethan made a decision. He promised himself that his company would change, that he would change. He would invest not just in markets but in people, starting with those who carried invisible burdens like his own. Later that evening, as the board gathered in the glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, Ethan surprised them all by closing his laptop and speaking without slides or charts. His voice was steady, but there was a rawness to it they had never heard before. He announced that the company would halt the deal they had been chasing so feverishly. Instead, they would commit funds and resources to building a support system for employees who cared for sick relatives, along with a volunteer program designed to match children and seniors, so no one would face dementia alone. The stunned silence in the room was almost tangible, a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Ethan saw the doubt in some eyes, but he felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time, he was not speaking as a CEO desperate for growth, but as a son who had nearly lost everything and been reminded of what truly mattered by the small hand of a brave girl. It did not take long for Ethan to learn more about the girl who had saved his mother. Over the following weeks he invited Lily and her father to his home several times, sometimes under the pretense of thanking them again, but in truth because he felt drawn to understand them. Daniel was a man in his late 30s with strong hands that bore the marks of years in physical work. He carried himself with humility, but there was an unmistakable intelligence in his eyes. He spoke carefully, as if weighing each word, and Ethan noticed that Lily often looked up at him with the kind of trust that only came from years of being cared for by someone who had never once broken a promise. Daniel admitted that raising Lily alone after the divorce had been difficult, but he had never once considered it a burden. She was his world, and he worked long hours at the warehouse to make sure she had everything she needed. Still, as much as he provided, there were things money could not buy, like time. Lily often spent afternoons with their neighbor, an older nurse named Mrs. Kennedy, who had taken a liking to her and taught her small lessons about kindness and care. It was Mrs. Kennedy who had explained how to talk to people who might be confused, how to smile and keep her voice calm, and how holding someone's hand could help them feel safe. Those simple teachings had guided Lily when she found Margaret wandering the streets. Listening to Daniel's story humbled Ethan in a way he had not anticipated. Here was a man who had no fortune, no empire, and yet he carried more strength and resilience than most of the executives Ethan had ever worked alongside. He saw how Daniel's love for his daughter had shaped her into the kind of child who could act decisively and compassionately in a moment of need. It made Ethan think of his own childhood, when Margaret had filled their home with books, with music, and with laughter, when she had believed so fiercely in his potential. He realized that in chasing ambition, he had risked losing the very heart of what she had given him. He had become a man who measured worth by contracts and numbers, while Daniel had built his life on something simpler and stronger, love and presence. One afternoon, after inviting Daniel to his office to talk more, Ethan offered him a position at Coal Dynamics. It was not charity but recognition. Ethan had seen the way Daniel thought about systems and logistics, how he noticed inefficiencies in the warehouse where he worked and suggested improvements that supervisors dismissed. Ethan understood that someone like Daniel could be invaluable in restructuring the bottlenecks that had plagued the company's operations for years. More importantly, he wanted to give him a schedule that allowed him to be present for Lily, because he knew firsthand what it meant for a child to have a parent close at hand. Daniel was stunned by the offer, hesitant at first, but when Ethan assured him that it was his skills, not pity, that inspired the decision, he accepted. For Lily, Ethan wanted something equally meaningful. She had mentioned in passing that she dreamed of playing the piano, that sometimes she would linger by the instrument in her school's music room long after class had ended. Ethan arranged for lessons and even promised her access to the grand piano kept in the lobby of his building. The day she first touched its keys, her small fingers trembling with excitement, Ethan stood nearby and felt a surge of emotion. He imagined Margaret sitting beside her, humming along, and he realized that this was not just about giving a child a chance, but about weaving new strands of connection between his mother's fading world and the younger generation. At home, Ethan made changes too. He worked with Miss Rosa, who had recovered from her illness, to create an environment where Margaret could feel secure. He filled the apartment with small reminders, photographs labeled in bold letters, clocks that chimed softly on the hour, the smell of freshly baked cookies and oranges that had once filled their kitchen when he was a boy. These became islands of memory for her to cling to when confusion clouded her mind. On the rooftop of the office building, he created a garden designed not for investors but for comfort. There were rows of lavender, petunias, and benches draped with blankets, with a sign that read, "If you forgot where you are safe." Employees began to use it not only for their loved ones but also for themselves, a place to breathe in the midst of the city's relentless pace. It was in these quiet, deliberate acts that Ethan began to feel something shift within him. He was no longer simply reacting to his mother's illness, he was building a world around her, a place where her fragility was not a burden but a reminder of what truly mattered. And he knew that none of it would have begun if not for the courage of a little girl who had seen in Margaret not a stranger but a grandmother in need of a guiding hand. The bond that had been forged between their families was no accident. It was, he believed, the kind of turning point life delivers only once, a chance to redefine what it means to lead, not just a company, but a life. The initiative that Ethan had announced in the boardroom soon grew from a daring idea into a living project that touched every corner of his company. He called it By the Hand, a name inspired by the sight of his mother walking through the city tethered to safety only because a child had offered her hand without hesitation. At first, his colleagues treated the project with skepticism, murmuring about costs, distractions, and lost opportunities. Yet as the program took shape, even the most hardened executives began to see that something profound was unfolding. A floor in the building was converted into a day center, a place where employees could bring their aging parents or vulnerable relatives during the workday. The rooms were painted in warm colors, filled with familiar objects, and staffed by caregivers who understood that dignity mattered as much as assistance. Margaret often visited, sometimes spending the afternoon listening to old records, sometimes simply sitting quietly by the windows. For Ethan, it was a relief to know she was safe even when he was immersed in meetings, but more than that, it was a promise to every worker in his company that they did not need to choose between their jobs and their families. Training sessions soon followed. Experts came to teach employees how to recognize the signs of memory loss, how to approach a conversation with patience rather than frustration, and how to redirect rather than argue when someone became confused. The sessions were unlike anything the company had ever hosted. Instead of presentations on profits or innovation, people sat in circles sharing stories about their own parents, their grandparents, or their neighbors who had begun to fade in ways that were both heartbreaking and human. For the first time, Ethan saw his staff speaking not as competitors or colleagues but as sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters. The culture of the company began to shift. Compassion became a language that threaded itself into daily work, as natural as quarterly goals and weekly reports. Publicly, the project began to draw attention when a short video surfaced online. A passerby had captured the moment in the lobby when Lily had guided Margaret to safety, her small hand clasped firmly around the older woman's fingers. The video spread quickly, not because it was sensational in the usual sense, but because it felt honest and deeply human. People saw not just a wealthy executive with his fragile mother, but a child whose simple bravery had reminded an entire corporation of its heart. Soon, local news stations were covering the story, and then national outlets. Billboards appeared across the city with Lily's image, a little girl with dark hair and striking blue eyes holding the hand of an elderly woman, the slogan beside her reading, "Sometimes heroes are shorter than we are." Lily, though shy at first, grew into the role of being the face of the campaign. She did not boast or act differently, she continued her piano lessons, her homework, and her afternoons with her father. Yet whenever she appeared at an event, people were struck by her sincerity. She spoke not of saving anyone but of doing what felt right, reminding everyone that kindness was not extraordinary, it was possible for anyone. For Ethan, watching her step into this role was both humbling and healing. He saw his mother's influence echoing through the project, her lifelong belief in the power of books, stories, and imagination now reborn as a living story about connection and care. The true shock for the public was not just that a major corporation had shifted its focus toward something so personal, but that it worked. Productivity rose rather than fell, employee turnover declined, and a sense of loyalty spread through the company. People were not only working for salaries anymore, they felt they were part of something meaningful. Ethan recognized that the success was not in numbers but in the way people treated one another. A manager who once barked orders now paused to ask if his assistant's father had been sleeping better. A group of interns volunteered weekends at the day center, laughing with patients as they played board games. These were changes no strategic plan could have forced, but they were as real and measurable as profit. As the project expanded beyond his company, partnerships with community centers and local governments began to form. Volunteers signed up to walk with seniors, to read with them, to keep them company. The city started to look different to Ethan, less like a battlefield of markets and more like a network of hands reaching out for one another. Every time he saw Lily's face on a poster or his mother smiling gently in the garden on the rooftop, he felt the same truth settle in his chest. It had all started with a child who refused to look away when she saw someone who was lost. It was that small act that had sparked a movement, and it was now his responsibility to make sure the flame never dimmed. A year later, the lobby of Coal Dynamics looked very different from the sterile space it had once been. The marble floors were still polished and the glass walls still reflected the bustle of the city, but now the heart of the room was not the reception desk or the towering displays of digital stock prices. At its center stood a grand piano, a gift from Ethan himself, polished to a mirror sheen and played several times a week during lunch hours by volunteers and students. It had become a symbol of the company's transformation, a reminder that its walls now held not just ambition but humanity. On a crisp spring afternoon, employees gathered quietly in the lobby while guests from outside streamed in. Among them sat Margaret, dressed in a soft lavender cardigan, her silver hair carefully brushed. Her hands rested on her lap, trembling only slightly, and her eyes wandered as though searching for something she could not quite name. Ethan hovered nearby, protective yet calm, watching the crowd part as Lily stepped forward in her blue dress. The girl no longer looked timid when facing a group of people. She had grown taller, her posture carrying a quiet confidence that seemed to glow from within. When she took her seat at the piano, a hush fell over the room, the kind of silence that comes not from command but from anticipation. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play Moon River. The notes floated upward, gentle and unhurried, filling the space with a warmth that softened even the hardest expressions in the audience. Ethan felt his throat tighten as the familiar melody washed over him, because it was a song his mother had loved when she was younger, a piece she used to hum while cooking dinner or shelving books in the library where she had once worked. As the music unfolded, something stirred in Margaret. At first her lips moved without sound, her eyes glistening as if she were chasing a memory just out of reach. Then, softly, almost to herself, she began to sing. Her voice was fragile and cracked, but it carried the melody perfectly, as though hidden deep within her was a part of her mind untouched by the illness. The audience leaned forward in astonishment. Ethan pressed his hand to his mouth, tears filling his eyes. For months he had feared that his mother's ability to connect had slipped away for good, yet here she was, her voice weaving into the music, reminding him of who she had been and who she still was. When the song ended, the silence that followed was thick with emotion before it gave way to applause. Daniel, standing in the back, whistled proudly for his daughter, and employees clapped with tears running down their faces. Lily smiled shyly, but her eyes sought Margaret, who looked at her with such tenderness it seemed to close the gap between generations. Ethan knelt by his mother's side, holding her hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Mom," he whispered, unable to stop the break in his voice, "You're still here." She turned to him, her eyes unclouded for that single moment, and replied with a small, radiant smile, "Baby, you came back. You did it. Everything is all right now." Those words sank into him with a force he could not describe. In that instant, nothing else mattered, not the deals he had abandoned, not the billions left on the table, not the endless climb of success he had once believed defined him. What mattered was this fragile circle of connection, his mother singing a song she remembered, Lily's music flowing like a bridge between past and present, and Daniel's steady presence reminding him that strength came in many forms. The crowd continued to applaud, but Ethan felt as though the noise was far away. What filled him instead was a profound sense of peace, a certainty that he had made the right choice when he turned away from profit to build something human. As the evening drew to a close, Ethan looked out across the lobby and thought about how far they had come. The garden on the rooftop had become a sanctuary, the day center bustled with laughter, and the By the Hand initiative had spread across the city, inspiring other companies to follow. His mother might still wander, and her memory might continue to fade, but she was never truly lost anymore. She was surrounded by a community that refused to let her walk alone. And it had all begun with a little girl who had chosen not to look away when she saw someone in need. When Ethan rose to thank the guests, his words were simple but carried the weight of everything he had learned. He told them that success could no longer be measured only in profits or market share, but in moments like this, when people were reminded of their shared humanity. He ended by looking at Lily, who stood quietly by the piano, and saying, "Sometimes the smallest hand can hold the greatest strength." The crowd fell silent again, and then erupted into applause once more. Ethan reached for his mother's hand and felt her fingers curl around his. For the first time in years he believed, with absolute certainty, that he was exactly where he was meant to be.